My name is Audrey Miller. 35 years old, single mother, accountant. I built my whole life around numbers, because numbers don't lie. Then my mother called. Don't come today. Adelaide's behavior will ruin my brunch. My investors don't need a scene. I was already on the road. Addie was in the backseat in her corduroy jacket, the one with the embroidered flowers on the collar, kicking her feet in that slow, steady rhythm she had when she was happy. She'd asked me 3 times that morning if Grandma would let her help with the rolls. I'm sure she will, I told her. The way mothers say things that aren't true but should be. 20 minutes later, I swiped my card at a gas station. Transaction declined. If this story already feels familiar, please hit subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. She had been draining my accounts for 14 months. Forged my signature on a loan. Intercepted my mail to hide the foreclosure on my apartment. And on Thanksgiving Day, she wouldn't even open the gate. I sat across from her in a lawyer's office and slid the audit report across the table. You're mischaracterizing what happened, Audrey. Sign it, Beatrice. Or the DA gets it next. For the first time in my life her hands were shaking. Mine were not. But will she actually honor what she signed? The 401k statement arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail Audrey Miller would later find darkly funny, that the worst thing she'd ever seen. Came dressed in ordinary paper, slipped between a water bill and a grocery store circular like it had every right to be there. She was sitting at the kitchen table when she opened it. Addie was in the next room watching cartoons, the volume turned up just enough that Audrey could hear the distant sound of animated laughter while her eyes moved down the page. She read the balance once. Then again. Then a third time, pressing her finger against the number as if the problem might be tactile. As if she had simply misread, misunderstood, miscounted the zeros. There were no zeros to count. There was nothing at all. The account showed a balance of $0.00. 31 years of contributions, the steady, disciplined accumulation of a woman who had grown up understanding that money was not a gift but a practice gone. The page offered no explanation. It stated only the fact, in clean black type, with the institutional serenity of a document that does not care what it means to the person holding it. Audrey set the paper down. She picked it up again. Outside, a November wind moved through the oak trees along the street, stripping the last of the brown leaves and sending them skittering across the sidewalk in dry, whispering clusters. The kitchen smelled of coffee gone cold and the faint sweetness of the banana bread she'd made on Sunday, the loaf now half gone on the counter. It was the smell of a normal week in a normal life, and Audrey sat inside it and felt the floor shift beneath her. She was an accountant. She had been an accountant for 11 years, and before that she had studied accounting because numbers were honest in a way that people sometimes weren't. Numbers did not equivocate. They did not smile at you and mean something else entirely. A balance sheet told you where you stood, and you either stood there or you didn't. She had always believed that. She had built her professional life on it, and some quieter, more private part of herself on it as well. And yet the number on the page was 0. Which meant something had happened that she did not have an explanation for. Which meant, she thought carefully, sitting very still, that someone did. She called Beatrice. Her mother answered on the 3rd ring with the particular tone she used for phone calls. She considered interruptions not unfriendly, exactly, but waited with a kind of patient sufferance. As if the world were always asking slightly too much of her. Audrey, I'm in the middle of something. Mom, I need to ask you about my retirement account. A pause. Brief, but there. What about it? The statement came today. It's showing a 0 balance. I don't understand how that's possible and I need you to help me understand it, because you've had access to the account and I. Audrey. Her mother's voice dropped into the register she reserved for moments when she wanted to convey that a conversation was becoming tiresome. I really cannot do this right now. I've been on my feet all morning and I'm feeling dizzy. You know how I get. And then, before Audrey could say another word, Beatrice mentioned the pill organizer, the weekly one, the pale blue plastic case, divided into 7 compartments that she had made something of a ritual object over the past several years. The visible evidence of her fragility, produced with exquisite timing whenever a conversation began to move in a direction she preferred it not to go. I haven't taken my afternoon medication yet and I'm already feeling it. Can we do this tomorrow? We'll talk at Thanksgiving. Mom. Tomorrow, Audrey, please. The call ended. Audrey held the phone against her chest for a moment, staring at the window. The oak trees moved. A car passed slowly on the street. She had a sensation she recognized but rarely named. The feeling of having asked a reasonable question and received an answer that was shaped like a reason but wasn't one. She had felt it before, in smaller ways, across the whole of her adult life. It was the feeling of a door closing in a room where you thought you lived. She put the phone down and went looking. She wasn't sure, afterward, what instinct moved her, whether it was the accountant's reflex to find the document, the child's reflex to find proof that what she feared was wrong, or something older and less nameable, the body's knowledge arriving ahead of the mind's. She moved through the house methodically, the way she moved through a set of financial records when something didn't reconcile. She was not frantic. She was precise. The tablecloth was still on the dining room table, the good one. The ivory linen that came out for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and the occasional dinner that Beatrice would have approved of, though Beatrice had not been to this apartment in over a year. Audrey had laid it out 2 days ago, ironing the fold lines flat with the careful attention she brought to domestic rituals, the way her mother had taught her. Set a beautiful table. Present well. Let the surface tell the story you want told. It was under the tablecloth. She almost missed it. It had slid partway beneath the extra fold at the far end of the table. And she found it only because she smoothed the cloth flat with both hands, the gesture habitual, the way you run your palm along a surface to make it right. The paper crinkled under her touch. She lifted the cloth and saw the document, and she picked it up with the same careful, deliberate steadiness she had used to pick up the 401k statement. The same refusal to rush toward what she already sensed she was about to find. It was a power of attorney. The notary seal was in the lower left corner. The signatures were in place, her own name, in her own hand. Or something close enough to her own hand that a person who was not looking for the difference might not find it. The document granted Beatrice Vance full financial authority over Audrey Miller's accounts, assets, and financial decisions. It was dated 14 months ago. Audrey did not remember signing it. She stood at the dining room table in the apartment she had carefully furnished over 5 years, in the home she had made for herself and her daughter, holding a piece of paper that explained where her retirement savings had gone and suggested, with the quiet precision of a legal document, that her own hands had authorized it. Her hands were shaking now. She watched them shake, almost with curiosity, the way you might watch a stranger's reaction to something. The paper trembled between her fingers. Through the wall, she could hear Addie's cartoon, a cheerful, bouncing melody, perfectly indifferent to what was happening in the next room. She thought of her mother's hands. The way Beatrice had held her as a child, steady and purposeful, guiding Audrey's small fingers through the steps of whatever lesson was currently being taught. How to set silverware in the correct order, how to address an envelope, how to write a thank you note in the proper form. Beatrice had been a precise teacher. She believed in doing things correctly. She had told Audrey, more times than Audrey could count, that presentation was character. That how you appeared to the world was who you were. Mom, Audrey said, to the empty room, to the ivory tablecloth, to the November light falling through the window in long pale rectangles across the floor. Did you take the money? The apartment did not answer. The cartoon played on. She set the document down on the table and walked to the window and stood there for a long moment, looking out at the street, at the bare-limbed oaks, at the ordinary Tuesday afternoon that had been, until approximately 40 minutes ago, the backdrop of a life she understood. The smell of the roasting turkey she'd planned for Thursday drifted from somewhere in the neighborhood. Rich and warm, and it turned in her stomach like something gone wrong. Like something sweet that had passed the point of sweetness into something else entirely. Like rot dressed up in the smell of a holiday. She had given Beatrice access to the accounts 4 years ago when her mother had asked. It had seemed, at the time, like a reasonable thing. A practical thing. Beatrice had framed it as a precaution. In case something happens to you, sweetheart, with Addie so young, someone needs to be able to step in, and Audrey had understood it as love. Which was how she had understood most of the things Beatrice did, at least until now. She looked at the power of attorney on the table. She looked at the 401k statement beside it. She looked at the number that was not there, the zero that sat where 11 years of her working life should have been. She did not cry. She was not ready to cry yet. She was still in the part that came before crying, the cold, clear, terrible part where you begin to understand the shape of what has been done to you. And you have to stay very still and very rational, because the alternative is to fall apart in a room where your daughter is watching cartoons and the afternoon is running out. And Thanksgiving is in 2 days and you are holding the evidence that someone you loved has been, for a very long time, doing something unforgivable. She sat back down at the kitchen table. She smoothed the 401k statement flat with her palm. She picked up her pen. She was an accountant. She knew how to read a record. She would start there. Thanksgiving morning arrived the way it always did in North Carolina, gray and cold, with a sky. The color of old pewter pressing low over the rooftops and the smell of wood smoke drifting through neighborhoods where people were already awake, already moving, already beginning the particular labor of the holiday. Audrey had been awake since 5. She had not slept well. She had lain in the dark with the power of attorney folded on the nightstand and the 401k statement face down beside it. As if not seeing the number could somehow slow the process of understanding what it meant. By 6:30 she had Addie up and dressed her daughter in the small corduroy jacket she loved, the one with the embroidered flowers on the collar that Dorothy from the church rummage sale had pressed into Audrey's hands last spring with a wave that said, "Don't argue about the price." Addie was 7, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. And she moved through the morning with the efficient cheerfulness of a child who did not yet know that adults could lie. Audrey watched her eat cereal at the kitchen table and felt the particular ache of that, the specific weight of knowing something your child does not. And working to keep your face arranged in the shape of normal. She had decided, somewhere in the sleepless middle of the night, that she would go to Thanksgiving. She would go to Beatrice's house, she would sit at Beatrice's table. And she would look her mother in the eye and ask her, calmly and clearly, to explain the account. She had rehearsed it. She was an accountant. She knew how to ask questions that required answers. Her phone rang at 8:47. Beatrice. She answered it with one hand on the steering wheel, Addie singing softly to herself in the back seat, the gray highway unrolling ahead of them. "Mom, we're already on the road. That's actually why I'm calling." Beatrice's voice was composed in that particular way, not warm, not cold, but managed, the way a temperature-controlled room is managed. "I need you to turn around, Audrey." "I'm sorry?" "The brunch. I have investors coming, people from the foundation board, and I think it's better if you don't come today. Adelaide's behavioral issues have been a topic before, and I can't have a scene in front of these people." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Addie stopped singing. "Behavioral issues," Audrey said. Very quietly. "You know what I mean. She's a lovely child but she's unpredictable, and today is important. I'll call you tomorrow and we can do something, just the 3 of us, something low-key." "Mom, I'm 100 miles from home." "Well, you should have called first." A pause. "I did text you last night." She hadn't. Audrey had checked her phone at midnight and again at 4 in the morning. The particular insomnia of a woman waiting for a message that would explain something inexplicable. There had been no text. She knew there had been no text. And she knew, with the flat, weary certainty of a person who has had this kind of conversation before, that pointing this out would accomplish nothing. Beatrice did not adjust her version of events in response to contradictory evidence. She absorbed the contradiction and continued. "We'll talk tomorrow," Beatrice said. "Enjoy the drive." The call ended. Audrey drove for another 11 miles before she needed gas. She pulled off at the first station. She saw a small independent place, 2 pumps, a hand-lettered sign advertising boiled peanuts in the window. She swiped her debit card at the pump and waited. Transaction declined. She stared at the screen. She tried again. Declined. She went inside and handed the card to the teenager behind the counter, who ran it twice and handed it back with the careful, non-committal expression of someone delivering information they didn't cause and couldn't fix. "It's not going through, ma'am." She tried her secondary card. Declined. She opened her banking app with hands that were already not quite steady and looked at the balance. And the number she saw was not the number that should have been there. Not by several $1,000s. Not by a margin that could be explained by an automatic payment or a forgotten subscription. The account had been drawn down, not emptied, not in one move, but reduced, in a series of transfers that she could see listed in the transaction history if she scrolled back far enough, each one modest enough to avoid triggering an alert. Each one consistent with the others in size and timing, the whole pattern as deliberate and methodical as a set of accounting entries made by someone who understood how not to be noticed. She understood, standing at the counter of a gas station on Route 40. With Addie visible through the window still sitting in the back seat, that her mother had not simply dipped into an account. Beatrice had been working, carefully, over time, with the patience of someone who was not improvising but executing a plan that had been in place long enough to be nearly complete. She had $14 in cash in her wallet. She bought a bottle of water and a bag of pretzels for Addie. And she went back to the car, and she sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before she started the engine. The hazard lights were still blinking from when she'd pulled off orange and steady, that slow mechanical pulse. That means something is wrong here, be careful, pay attention. She hadn't turned them off. She watched them reflect in the puddles on the pavement, that rhythmic orange flash in the gray rain that had started sometime in the last hour. And she thought about all the ways she had explained things to herself over the years. The account access was a precaution. The power of attorney was practical. The things Beatrice did that felt wrong had reasonable explanations she simply didn't have yet. The hazard lights blinked. The rain came down. "Mommy?" Addie's voice from the backseat, careful in the way children's voices get when they sense something they can't name. "It's okay, baby." Audrey's voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. "We're just figuring out the route." She pulled back onto the highway. She drove toward the Vance estate because she had nowhere else to go and because somewhere in the cold practical center of her, beneath the fear and the hurt and the dawning fury, she was still trying to find an explanation that was not the one she already knew was true. She drove through the rain with $14 in her wallet and a daughter in her backseat and the hazard lights still blinking in her memory. Like a heart that doesn't know yet it's been stopped. "You're leaving your granddaughter on the street for a brunch?" she said, to no one, to the rain-blurred windshield, to the mother who was not there to hear it. The highway answered with nothing but the sound of water under tires. The Vance estate sat at the end of a long, tree-lined drive in one of those neighborhoods that announced its wealth quietly, not through ostentation, but through the particular quality of its silence, the way the trees were old and evenly spaced, the way the lawns extended without apology in all directions, the way the houses were set back from the road far enough that you had to choose to approach them. Beatrice had lived there for 22 years. She had chosen the neighborhood with the same deliberateness with which she chose everything: the right address, the right associations, the right image of a life lived correctly and prosperously and without visible difficulty. The electronic gate at the end of the drive was closed. Audrey pulled up to it and rolled down her window. The rain had softened to a mist now, the kind that isn't quite rain, but isn't not rain either, the kind that settles on your face and your coat and makes everything slightly colder than it should be. She pressed the call button on the intercom panel. It was a nice panel, brushed steel, recessed into a stone pillar. The kind of fixture that communicated that the people inside were not to be approached casually. It buzzed. Then Beatrice's voice, rendered thin and metallic by the intercom speaker. "Who is it?" Not a question. The flat declarative of someone who has already decided. "Mom, it's me. It's Audrey. Please open the gate." A pause, long enough to be intentional. "I told you not to come." "I know, but my card was declined and I have $14 and Addie's in the car and I need help. Please." She kept her voice even. She was aware of how it sounded, the specific cadence of adult desperation. The register of a person who knows they are asking for something that should not have to be asked for. "Mom, open the gate. This is not a good time. It's Thanksgiving." Which is exactly why this is not a good time. "I have people here, Audrey, I have guests, and you showing up like this." A pause in which Audrey could hear, beneath the digital static of the intercom, the particular quality of Beatrice's restraint, the held breath of a woman managing a situation. "You're embarrassing me in front of the neighbors." Audrey looked around. And it was true, not in the way Beatrice intended it to be true, not as an accusation that landed cleanly, but as a simple observable fact. On the porch of the house across the street, a couple in their 60s had stopped what they were doing and were watching. 2 houses down, a man raking leaves had gone still. A woman walking a small dog on the sidewalk had slowed, her attention caught by the scene, the car idling at the gate. The woman in the driver's window, the child visible in the backseat. Addie had climbed up to look out the rear window. Audrey didn't tell her to sit back down. Mom. She pressed the call button again. The intercom crackled. I'm not a scene. I'm your daughter. Nothing. Then, from behind the gate, from somewhere in the long tree-lined distance between the gate and the house, the sound of the front door opening. Beatrice appeared on the front steps, wearing the gray cashmere. She saved for occasions, her posture impeccable, her silver hair arranged with the precision of a woman who began each day with an intention toward control. She stood at the top of the steps and looked toward the gate. And from that distance 30, 40 yards she looked exactly like the person she had always presented herself to be. Dignified, composed, in charge of her surroundings. She raised one hand, not in greeting but in dismissal. A single, elegant, definitive gesture, the kind that required no words. Then she turned and went back inside. The door closed. Audrey sat at the gate for another moment. The mist continued its patient work against the windshield. The couple on the porch had gone inside. The man with the rake had resumed his raking. Though with less conviction now, the way people resume activities when they are still watching from the corner of their attention. The woman with the dog had moved on. Mommy? Addie's voice was smaller now. It's okay. Audrey heard herself say it from somewhere outside herself. The automatic pilot of a mother whose child must not be allowed to see the full dimensions of what is happening. Grandma's busy today. We're going to find somewhere warm, okay? We're going to be okay. She put the car in reverse. The gate stayed closed. Beatrice's cameras, Audrey knew because she had helped her mother choose the security system 2 years ago. Had researched the models and compared the options and made a recommendation, because that was the kind of daughter she had been. Were recording all of it. The car at the gate. The woman in the window. The child in the backseat. The whole scene, in high definition, catalogued and stored on a hard drive inside the house. She thought about that as she backed out onto the road. That every moment of this was being recorded by equipment she had helped select, in a house she had spent her life trying to belong to, behind a gate that her own mother would not open. There was a feeling that went with that knowledge. It was not grief exactly, and it was not quite anger yet, though anger was coming. She could feel it building somewhere below the numbness, patient and slow, like water finding the crack in a foundation. What she felt right now was something closer to the experience of hearing a final note the way a door sounds when it closes all the way. The mechanical click of a latch engaging, the small definitive sound of a thing that is finished. She had not been a human being to Beatrice today. She had been a glitch. An irregularity in the presentation of a life that was supposed to look a certain way. The investors were inside. The foundation board members were inside. The image that Beatrice had spent decades constructing and maintaining and protecting was inside. And Audrey and her daughter and their $14 were outside, in the mist, at a gate that would not open. She drove until the Vance estate disappeared from her rearview mirror. She drove past the old growth oaks and the discreet stone pillars and the perfect November lawns. She drove out of the neighborhood and back onto the ordinary road, where the houses were smaller and closer together and the leaves were in piles at the curb that nobody had picked up yet. And she kept driving because stopping felt like something she could not afford to do. In the backseat, Addie had gone quiet. The small corduroy jacket with the embroidered flowers. The dark eyes that watched her mother's face in the rearview mirror with the careful, calibrated attention of a child who has learned to read the weather in a parent's expression. Are we going to Grandma's? Addie asked. Not today, baby. Is Grandma mad? Audrey looked at her daughter in the mirror. She thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without being the whole truth. Because the whole truth was not something a 7-year-old should be asked to carry. Grandma has a lot going on today, she said finally. But we're going to be okay. I promise you that. It was the most important promise she had ever made, and she made it without knowing, in that moment, how she would keep it. She made it anyway. That was what mothers did, or what they were supposed to do, the ones who meant it. The ones for whom love was not a currency but a fact. She filed that thought away without examining it, because examining it right now would cost her the steadiness she needed to keep driving. And she needed to keep driving, because the afternoon was getting colder and the mist was thickening back toward rain, and she had $14 and nowhere to go. She kept her hands on the wheel. She kept her eyes on the road. She kept going. She found the motel the way you find things when you are not really looking for them, by running out of other options. It was off a county road 6 miles east of the highway. A single-story row of rooms in the particular shade of beige that suggested it had once been a different color, and no one had quite decided what color it should become. The sign said vacancy in red letters, one of the V's slightly darker than the others where the bulb was going. It cost $48 a night. Audrey had 14. She sat in the parking lot and looked at the motel and looked at her phone and tried to think of who she could call. She went through the list with the methodical, emotionless efficiency of a person doing triage. The friends who would help if she asked, who lived far enough away that asking would require explanations she didn't have the words for yet, the colleagues. Who would be bewildered, the neighbor who watched Addie on late nights, who was kind but who had her own family. Her own Thanksgiving table, her own life that Audrey had no right to interrupt with the full weight of what was happening. She could not think of anyone she could call without it costing more than she had, more dignity, more explanation. More exposure of the thing she had been, she realized now, quietly protecting for years. The truth that her mother was not what she appeared. The truth that Audrey's life, from the outside, looked functional and together and managed. And that from the inside it had been built on a foundation she had never been allowed to inspect. She opened her email. She did not know why she opened her email. She had already checked it twice today, looking for she was not sure what. Some document she had missed. Some record that would make the account balance make sense in a way that didn't mean what she knew it meant. She scrolled through the inbox without purpose, the way you move through a familiar room in the dark. Until her eye caught a subject line she had not seen before. Notice of foreclosure proceeding 2847 Marchmont Avenue, Unit 4. Her apartment. She read it twice. Then she read the sender, a law firm she did not recognize, on behalf of a lender she had never borrowed from. The notice was dated 3 weeks ago. The apartment, according to the document attached, which she opened with fingers that had gone very cold, colder than the November air outside could account for, had been used as collateral for a loan she had not applied for, carrying a signature that looked enough like hers that it had satisfied a notary and a bank and presumably a lawyer. Beatrice had been intercepting her mail. The physical notices, the preliminary letters, the payment demands, the formal communications that preceded a foreclosure action had gone to the Marchmont address and never reached her. Because she had given her mother a key to the building 3 years ago. For exactly the same reason she had given her the account access, because her mother had asked, and because the asking had been framed as care. The phone screen blurred. She realized she was crying, which she had not done yet today, which she had been carefully, consciously not doing because Addie was there and Addie was watching, and Audrey had learned a long time ago. In a house with Beatrice, that crying was something you did in private or not at all. But Addie was asleep now. She had fallen asleep somewhere in the last hour of driving, her head tipped sideways against the window, her breath fogging the glass in small regular clouds, and the parking lot was empty, and the motel sign buzzed its one imperfect letter, and there was nobody watching, nobody managing the image. Nobody for whom she needed to hold the shape of a person who was fine. So she cried. She gripped the steering wheel with both hands and she cried without sound, the way you cry when you have been not crying for a very long time. And your body finally takes the choice away from you. She cried for the retirement account that wasn't there. She cried for the apartment she was going to lose. She cried for the gate that didn't open and the card that didn't work and the 100 miles of highway between herself and any version of safety she could name. She cried for Addie asleep in the backseat in the corduroy jacket with the flowers on the collar, for the childhood she was supposed to be protecting and the specific quality of failing at it in a motel parking lot with $14 and the evidence of a crime in her email inbox. And then, because she was her mother's daughter in at least this one way, she stopped. She pressed both palms against her face. She breathed. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror, the red eyes, the smeared mascara. She hadn't thought to wear waterproof today because she had not planned for today to be this kind of day. And she said, quietly, to the face in the mirror, to the woman she was looking at, who was 35 years old and alone in a parking lot in North Carolina on Thanksgiving night. How did I let her steal everything? Not an accusation, not quite a question. Something between the two. The flat, bare fact of it, stated as plainly as she could stand. She had been an accountant for 11 years. She understood financial instruments. She understood the mechanics of fraud. She had never, in her professional life, failed to notice when the numbers didn't reconcile. And yet here, in the one place where she had wanted most to believe, the accounting was sound in her own family. With her own mother she had chosen not to look. She had looked at the surface of the numbers and called the surface the whole picture. Because the alternative was to see what the whole picture actually showed. She knew what it showed now. The cold of the November night was moving in through the doors now, finding the gaps in the old car's weather sealing. Settling against her legs and her hands with the patient, impersonal chill of a season that does not care what it finds. The parking lot lights buzzed. A truck moved slowly past on the county road, its taillights fading into the dark. In the backseat, Addie shifted in her sleep and pulled her jacket tighter around herself. The unconscious self-preservation of a child who doesn't know yet that she's cold. Audrey looked at her daughter for a long time. There was a specific quality to watching a child sleep that could break you open or hold you together, depending on what you brought to it. Tonight it did both. It broke her open because Addie had done nothing to deserve this. Not the parking lot. Not the motel they couldn't afford, not the grandmother who had weighed the cost of opening a gate and found her granddaughter wanting. And it held her together because the alternative, falling apart, completely, dissolving into the grief and the fury and the cold, was not something she could afford to do with Addie 3 feet away. She checked the bank balance again, though she already knew the number. $14.28. The 28 cents felt like a particular cruelty, that small, almost $15 amount. As if something that had once been more had been reduced until it was almost nothing, but not quite, so that you could not even say you had nothing. You had $14 and change. You had almost nothing. You had exactly enough to feel the distance between what you had and what you needed. She opened the Notes app on her phone and started writing. Not to anyone, not yet. Just to herself, in the flat, orderly way. She processed information when the information was too large and too immediate to hold in her head without arranging it somewhere. 401k0. Account draws systematic, documented. Power of attorney signed, forged or coerced. 14 months ago. Apartment foreclosure collateral loan, not mine. Mail intercepted. $14. She read the list back. It was precise. It was documented. It was the kind of list that, in a professional context, would constitute the beginning of an audit trail. She looked at it with the accountant's part of her mind, the part that did not feel things, that only measured them, and she recognized what it was. It was evidence. She did not know yet what she was going to do with it. She did not know where she was going to sleep tonight, or how she was going to pay for it, or what Addie was going to eat for breakfast. She did not know how long it would take, or what it would cost her. Or whether the machinery of justice moved quickly enough and fairly enough for someone with $14 to access it. She knew none of those things. But she had the list. And she had 11 years of professional experience that told her what lists like this were for. And somewhere beneath the grief and the cold and the exhaustion and the specific particular humiliation of spending Thanksgiving in a motel parking lot in North Carolina, something else was forming, something quieter and slower and more durable than any of the other things she was feeling. She did not have a name for it yet. She put the car in park, turned the heat up as high as it would go, and sat with her daughter in the cold parking lot and waited for morning. Well, friends, here we are halfway through Audrey's story, and I have to say, if your heart isn't aching for her right now, I'd be surprised. We've watched this woman discover that the person she trusted most in this world, her own mother, had quietly, methodically, taken everything she'd worked for. The retirement account she'd built over 11 years. Her access to her own money. The home she'd made for herself and her little girl. And then, when Audrey showed up desperate and asking for help on Thanksgiving Day, that gate didn't open. $14. A sleeping child in the backseat. And a list in her phone that she knows, somewhere deep down, is the beginning of something. Coming up in the second half, Audrey finds the warmth she never had at home. And she starts to use every skill she's ever had to build the case that's going to change everything. The truth is coming, and when it arrives, it's going to be something to see. Stay with us. Dorothy Miller found them just after 7 in the morning. She had been driving back from her sister's place in Raleigh, a 4-hour drive she'd made twice a year for 30 years. Always leaving early so she could be home before George woke up, and started worrying when she saw the car in the motel parking lot. The one with the windows fogged and the hazard lights still blinking, because Audrey had turned them on sometime in the night and forgotten to turn them off. Dorothy was 72 years old, a retired nurse, and she had spent 40 years reading situations the way other people read print. She pulled over. What followed was brief and practical in the way that Dorothy was brief and practical. She had learned, in 4 decades of nursing, that people in crisis did not need ceremony, they needed warmth and a next step. She knocked on the window. She said, simply and without drama, that she had a farmhouse 20 minutes away and a pot of coffee already on and whatever else was needed. She said it the way she said most things, as if it were obvious, as if there were no other reasonable option. As if the answer to a woman and a child in a cold car on Thanksgiving morning were simply to bring them somewhere warm. Addie woke up when the car stopped in the Miller driveway and looked out the window at the farmhouse white clapboard, a covered porch with 2 rocking chairs. A bare-limbed maple in the yard losing its last leaves to the November wind, and said, with the directness of a child, that it looked like a house in a book. George Miller was in the kitchen. He was 68, broad-shouldered and quiet, a man whose primary mode of communication was action rather than language. He had a bowl of soup on the table within 4 minutes of their arrival. Cream of potato, still hot from the pot he'd made the night before, and he pulled out the chair for Addie with the natural ease of a man who had been pulling out chairs for people his whole life. The soup was hot and plain and perfect. Addie ate with both hands around the bowl, the way children eat when they are cold and hungry. And no one is watching to correct their table manners, and Audrey sat across from her and tried to hold herself together and mostly failed. She cried again at the table. She apologized for it. Dorothy handed her a dish towel, which was the most practical and therefore the most comforting response possible, and sat down across from her and waited. "Why are you being so nice to us?" Audrey asked. She meant it as a genuine question. She had been trying to understand it since the night before, in the parking lot. The mechanics of kindness that asked nothing in return, that simply presented itself without framing or explanation or condition. Dorothy looked at her the way she looked at a lot of things, steadily, without hurry. "Because you needed it," she said. Which was the whole answer. Which was, Audrey understood, sitting there with the dish towel and the soup and the November light coming through the kitchen window, the only answer there was. She thought about her childhood. The specific texture of growing up in Beatrice's house, the lessons in presentation. The careful coaching in how to appear, the smile that arrived most reliably when Audrey brought home the grade or the trophy or the distinction that reflected well on the family. She thought about how she had internalized the lesson so completely that she had not, until this morning, understood it as a lesson. She had understood it as love. She had taken the conditional thing and called it the real thing. Because the conditional thing was all she had ever been given, and you do not know, when you have only ever been given one kind of thing, that other kinds exist. Addie was talking to George now, explaining something about her school's Thanksgiving project, the paper feathers they had made from traced handprints. The pilgrim hats that didn't stay on straight. George was listening with his full attention, nodding at the right moments, asking the right questions. He did not look like a man who was indulging a child. He looked like a man who was interested in what a child had to say. Audrey watched this. She watched it and she felt something that she didn't have a word for, a feeling that was partly grief and partly recognition and partly something else. Something she had not felt in a long time, something she had almost stopped believing was available to her. The feeling of being in a room where people were good to each other. Simply, without performance, without the careful management of impression. Just good. Some families were found in the wreckage of a storm. She had read that somewhere once, or heard it, or perhaps she had simply known it in the way that you know things you have not yet lived. Sitting in Dorothy Miller's kitchen on Thanksgiving morning with $14 in her wallet and a foreclosure notice in her email and a daughter eating soup with both hands. She found herself thinking that she was going to be all right. Not immediately, not easily, but all right. She finished her coffee. She looked at her phone. She looked at the list she had made in the parking lot the night before, the precise, documented professionally organized list of everything that had been done to her, and she thought about what an accountant does with a list like that. She thought about what came next. George Miller had a room he called the office, which was less an office than a repurposed sitting room. With a desk in the corner and a printer that worked most of the time and a Wi-Fi connection that was slower than Audrey was used to but faster than nothing, which was what she'd had in the motel parking lot. He showed her to it on the second morning she and Addie had stayed, because Dorothy had asked them to and because Audrey had nowhere else to go. And because she had, somewhere between the soup and the second cup of coffee, made a decision. She was going to look at the records. She had her laptop. She had her accounting software, the professional grade package she'd maintained a personal license for since her freelance years. The one that could parse transaction histories and generate audit trails. And do the patient, granular work of following money through a system until you found where it had gone and how it had gotten there. She had 11 years of professional experience. She had the 401k statement, the power of attorney, the foreclosure notice, and the transaction history from her accounts, which she had downloaded in the parking lot and saved in 3 places before she'd done anything else, the precautionary reflex of a woman who understood how evidence worked. She set up at George's desk and she started at the beginning. The beginning, in financial terms, was the first anomalous transaction, the first point at which the record diverged from what it should have been. She found it 14 months ago, which matched the date on the power of attorney. A transfer of $1,200 from her savings account to an account she did not recognize. Small enough to miss in a busy month. Documented as a management fee, which was not a category she had ever established in her personal accounting. She followed the thread. The transfers were consistent, not identical, which would have made them easier to flag, but consistent in their character. They ranged from $800 to $2,200. They occurred at irregular intervals that nonetheless had a pattern, the way irregular breathing has a pattern when you know how to read it. They were routed through an account in the name of Vance Family Management LLC, which was a company she had never heard of, which she confirmed, by mid-morning of the second day, had been registered in North Carolina with a registered agent whose name meant nothing to her. Filed on a date that was 3 months after the power of attorney had been executed. It was clean work. Beatrice was not a financial professional, but she was disciplined and she was careful, and she had clearly had helped the structure of the LLC. The routing of the transfers, the careful sizing that stayed below automatic reporting thresholds. Someone with professional knowledge had set this up. The question of who would be part of what came later. On the third day, she found Sloan. It took her longer than it should have, because she wasn't looking for Sloan specifically, she was following the money forward from the Vance Family Management account. Tracing where it went after it arrived, and it took 3 separate transaction chains. And a corporate filing she accessed through the state's public records database before she confirmed what she had begun to suspect. The money that had left her accounts had moved, in tranches, into an operating account for a company called Sloan Vance Interiors. A home design business that had been operating at a loss for 4 consecutive years. A business whose cash flow statements, which were partly visible through a licensing filing she found in the public record, showed the specific pattern of a company kept alive by infusions from outside its own revenue. Audrey sat back in George's chair and looked at the screen. Her mother had used her identity to secure a high-interest loan. She had found the loan agreement itself by the 4th day. Filed under a lender registration number that led her to a small commercial lender in Charlotte. The documents bearing her forged signature alongside Beatrice's as co-guarantor, the proceeds disbursed in a lump sum to Vance Family Management and from there to Sloan Vance Interiors within the same week. She had used Audrey's retirement account as collateral for a second instrument she was still mapping. She had systematically transferred funds from Audrey's checking and savings over 14 months. She had intercepted mail to prevent discovery. She had used a power of attorney she had no legal right to execute. Audrey had not signed it, of that she was now certain, because she had found a handwriting analyst online who reviewed documents professionally, and she had uploaded the signature. And the preliminary analysis had come back with a confidence assessment she could add to the file. She had a file now. An actual file organized, chronological, cross-referenced, with source documentation and transaction records and corporate filings and the handwriting analysis and the foreclosure notice. and the 401k statement and the power of attorney and the loan agreement. She had put it together the way she put every audit together, methodically, without emotion, following the money until the money told its own story. The story the money told was unambiguous. It was the story of a fraud. She printed the summary report on George's printer, which took longer than she would have liked and jammed once in the middle. And she stood over it as it came through page by page in the quiet of the farmhouse office, and she read each page as it emerged. And she felt something she had not expected to feel, which was not anger and not grief but something cleaner than either. On the screen, the forged signature on the loan agreement looked back at her. Every pixel of it, each line of the letters that were almost hers but weren't almost. But not quite, in the way that a copy is almost but not quite the original, in the way that a performance of a person is almost but not quite the person. She thought about Beatrice standing on the front steps in the gray cashmere. The raised hand, the door closing. "I'm not the embarrassment," she said quietly, to the screen, to the signature. That wasn't hers, to the documentation of 14 months of careful, deliberate, professional betrayal. "You're the criminal." The printer finished. She stacked the pages. She reached for her phone and pulled up the number of the attorney she had found 2 days ago, a woman in Charlotte, who specialized in financial fraud and elder law, who had a reputation in the professional community that Audrey had verified through 3 separate sources. Because she was an accountant and she verified things. She had not called yet. She had waited until she had the file. She had the file. She pressed call. The hum of the printer faded into the farmhouse quiet, the wind outside, the distant sound of Addie and Dorothy in the kitchen. The ordinary sounds of a house where people lived without pretense. And in that quiet, the sound of a phone ringing in a law office in Charlotte felt, to Audrey, like the sound of something beginning. Not an ending, not yet, but the machinery of the ending, starting to turn. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, which struck Audrey, later, as exactly right. That the thing began on a Tuesday and found its resolution on a Tuesday, ordinary and unremarkable in its framing, the most honest possible setting for what turned out to be the most honest conversation of her life. The law office was in a building on the 7th floor of a steel and glass tower in uptown Charlotte. The kind of office that communicated competence without warmth, clean lines, neutral colors, the quiet of expensive carpet and climate control. Audrey arrived 20 minutes early and sat in the waiting area and looked at the folder on her lap. The physical copy of the audit report she had built over 4 days at George Miller's desk, organized into tabbed sections with a summary sheet on top that could, in under 3 minutes, tell any competent reader exactly what had happened and to whom and over what period of time. Beatrice arrived 6 minutes late. Audrey had expected that. Beatrice was not a person who arrived on time to events she had not chosen. She came in from the elevator with Sloane beside her, Sloane in a coat that was too expensive for a woman whose company had been running at a loss for 4 years. Which Audrey noted with the particular attention she now brought to all details that would be relevant later. Beatrice was in the gray cashmere again. She looked, at first glance, exactly as she always looked, composed. Controlled, the expression of a woman who has managed every room she has ever walked into and sees no reason why this one should be different. She saw Audrey. Something crossed her face. It was brief, and it was quickly managed, and if you were not watching for it you would not have seen it. Audrey was watching for it. They sat down on opposite sides of the table. The attorney, whose name was Sandra Graves and who had the quality of perfect stillness that the best advocates cultivate, the ability to be absolutely present without projecting anything, sat at the head and did not speak immediately. She had reviewed the report. Audrey knew she had reviewed it because she had sent it 48 hours in advance. And Sandra had called her back within 3 hours with a list of follow-up questions that confirmed she had read it carefully and understood what it meant. Audrey placed the folder on the table. "I want to walk you through the audit," she said. Her voice was level. She had practiced being level, in the quiet of the farmhouse, sitting on the edge of the bed while Addie slept, speaking to the wall. She had practiced it the way she had practiced every important presentation in her professional life, not for passion, but for precision, because precision was more powerful than passion and would hold up better under pressure. "I've organized it chronologically. We'll start 14 months ago," she began. Beatrice did not interrupt, at first. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, the way she sat when she was performing Patience. And she let Audrey move through the transaction history and the LLC formation and the loan agreement and the handwriting analysis and the mail interception, page by page, section by section, the whole architecture of it laid out in sequence. Sandra Graves did not speak. Sloane stared at the table. It was when Audrey reached the loan agreement, the high-interest loan secured against her identity. The proceeds routed to Sloane's failing business, that Beatrice moved. She shifted in her chair. She opened her mouth. Audrey. The tone was the one she used when she wanted to convey that a conversation was getting away from her. Controlled, a little tired, as if she were the one being subjected to something unreasonable. You're mischaracterizing what happened. What I did was protect the family's financial interests during a difficult period, and I had the legal authority to. You didn't. Sandra Graves spoke for the first time. 2 words, delivered without inflection, into the middle of Beatrice's sentence. Then silence. Beatrice looked at her. The composed expression held for a moment. Then something in it shifted very slightly, the way a facade shifts when the structure behind it develops a crack. Not collapse. Not yet. But the first indication that collapse was possible. The power of attorney document in evidence, Sandra continued, in the same measured tone, was executed without Ms. Miller's knowledge or consent. The handwriting analysis places the probability of forgery at above 92%. The transfers, the loan, the LLC, all of them flow from an instrument that is legally void. Which means everything that followed is exposure. For both of you. She looked at Sloane. Sloane looked at the table. Audrey watched her mother's hands. She had not expected it to matter to her, the hands, specifically, but it did. They were on the table, still folded, but the folding was different now. Tighter. The knuckles slightly pale. She was 62 years old, Beatrice, and she had been in control of her surroundings for so long that the experience of not being in control had left a visible mark on her in real time. In the specific language of a body that was discovering, for perhaps the first time, that it was not as safe as it had believed. She looked small. Audrey had not expected that either. She had expected, she was not certain what she had expected. Defiance, perhaps. More of the managed performance she had watched her whole life. Not this. Not the visible diminishment of a woman who had always seemed to occupy her space with absolute confidence. Who had always seemed to take up exactly as much room as she chose and leave precisely what she intended. She did not feel pity. She had examined that question in the farmhouse, in the quiet, and she had found that she did not. What she felt was something that had no clean word for it. Something that was the absence of the thing she had spent her life trying to earn, released at last from the effort of trying to earn it. She pulled the settlement agreement from the back of the folder and placed it on the table. Today, she said quietly, the law wrote in ink what my heart had been shouting in silence. She slid the document across the table. Sign it, Beatrice. She held her mother's eyes. Or the DA gets it next. Beatrice looked at the document. She looked at Sandra Graves. She looked at Sloane, who was still looking at the table and who did not, in this moment, look like anyone's ally. She looked back at Audrey, and for a long moment. There was nothing in her expression that Audrey could read, because whatever her mother was feeling was something she had never shown before. Whether it was shame or calculation or some combination of the two that Beatrice herself could not have separated, Audrey could not tell. Then Beatrice picked up the pen. The click of it was small in the quiet room. Sandra Graves did not move. Sloane did not speak. Audrey breathed, slowly, and watched her mother sign her name to a document that would return the accounts, satisfy the lender, lift the foreclosure, and carry with it a legal restraining order that would run for 3 years. The click of the pen. The most honest sound she had ever heard. She gathered the documents when they were signed methodically, in order, the way she gathered everything. She put them in the folder. She stood up from the table and she straightened her coat and she looked at Beatrice one last time. There was nothing more to say, she found. She had prepared things to say, in the farmhouse, in the quiet phrases she had thought might be necessary. The last words of a child to a parent, the summation of a relationship. But sitting across from the woman and seeing what she saw, she found the words unnecessary. The document said what needed to be said. The record said it. The audit trail said it, with the precision and completeness of a thing that does not require interpretation. She picked up her folder and she walked out. In the elevator, going down, she looked at her reflection in the polished steel doors, the clear eyes, the steady hands, the woman in the glass who looked like herself, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Something she did not want to name too quickly, in case naming it made it fragile. She pressed the lobby button. The elevator descended. Outside, on the street, the November air was cold and clear. And the city moved around her with the indifferent purposefulness of a world that had not paused for her crisis and would not pause for its resolution. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the folder under her arm, and she looked up at the sky, gray and flat and honest. No performance in it at all, no careful management of the light. Then she flagged a cab and went back to the farmhouse. The paperwork for the name change came through on a Thursday in late October, which was a year and a week after the Thanksgiving morning when Addie had pressed her small face against the car window in the motel parking lot and fogged the glass with her breath. Sleeping through the worst night of her mother's life with the uncomplicated trust of a child who does not yet know that the ground can shift. Audrey was sitting at the kitchen table in the farmhouse when the envelope arrived, the one with the official seal. The one she had been waiting for, with the patient, unhurried quality she had learned to bring to waiting since she had come to live on the Miller farm. The understanding that things that were worth having took the time they took and arrived when they arrived and not before. Dorothy brought it in from the mailbox and set it on the table with the small, private smile she had been wearing more often lately. The one that meant she knew something good was about to happen and was pleased to be in proximity to it. Audrey opened it carefully. The name change order was a single page, official and spare, with the court seal in the corner and the judge's signature at the bottom. It listed 2 names. The names that were being changed from. The names that were being changed to. Adelaide Vance Miller, Adelaide Dorothy Miller. Audrey Vance Miller, Audrey Miller. She read them twice. She set the page flat on the table and looked at it the way she had looked at the 401k statement 14 months ago. With her full attention, with her hands steady, with the deliberate focus of a woman who wants to make certain she is reading what she thinks she is reading and not something else. But there was no mistake here. There was no 0 where a number should have been. There was only what was there, exactly as it appeared. She had dropped the Vance. Just that. The removal of a single word from the middle of a name, and yet the page looked entirely different without it. It looked, she thought, like itself. Addie came in from the yard where she had been helping George with the last of the fall planting, her boots muddy and her jacket streaked with the particular honest dirt of actual work, her cheeks red from the cold. She was 8 now. She had grown almost 2 inches since the summer and had taken, recently, to spending her afternoons in the barn with George's 2 border collies, who had adopted her. With the discerning enthusiasm of animals that recognize a person who will take them seriously. "Did it come?" she asked, looking at her mother's face. Reading it with the accuracy that children develop when they have been paying close attention to adult expressions for a long time. It came. Addie crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and looked at the page. She was at the age where she could read official documents, if she went slowly, which she did now, her finger tracing the lines, her lips moving slightly with the effort of parsing the formal language. Then she looked up at her mother. "Adelaide Dorothy Miller," she said, trying out the name, tasting it, "like Miss Dorothy, like Miss Dorothy." Addie looked at the page again. Then she looked at her mother with the clear, direct assessment of a child who has decided something. "I like it," she said. Simply, completely, with the finality of a person who does not require further discussion. Then she pulled off her muddy boots at the back door and went to find Dorothy. Audrey sat at the table for a while longer. Through the kitchen window, she could see the Miller farm as it looked in late October, the fields gone to their winter rest, the old maple in the yard past its peak color now, but still holding a few last leaves in the particular amber that she had come to think of as the farm's signature, the color she associated with arriving here and finding warmth. The 2 border collies were racing each other across the yard in wide looping circles, for no reason other than the pleasure of it, which she had come to find both funny and instructive. She thought about Beatrice. She did this less often now, not because the anger had entirely gone, but because she had learned, over the past year, that the anger was most useful when it was directed at something specific, and the specific things it needed to be directed at had mostly been addressed. The settlement had been honored. The accounts were restored. The foreclosure had been lifted. The loan had been resolved. The restraining order was in place. Sloane had closed her business, which had been insolvent without the infusions, and had moved out of state. Which was a development Audrey had learned from a mutual acquaintance and received without particular reaction. The record was complete. The audit was closed. She had no further use for the version of herself that spent its energy managing the emotional ledger of her mother's choices. That version had served its purpose. She was moving on. She had started a private practice. 3 clients so far: small businesses in the county, local farmers and a restaurant owner who needed help with their books. The kind of work that was not glamorous and was not what she had imagined for herself at 35, but which was honest and which was hers. She had a room in the farmhouse, and Addie had a room down the hall, and Dorothy had taken to keeping a jar of wildflowers on the kitchen table that she refreshed every few days from wherever she found them, even in October. Even when what she was finding was dried goldenrod and the last of the asters. She picked up the name change order and held it in both hands. The court seal. The judge's signature. The 2 names, listed and official and real. She looked at her new driver's license, which had arrived the week before. And which she had been carrying in her wallet alongside the old one, not quite ready to throw the old one away, not quite sure why, until now. She took both out and set them on the table side by side. In the old one, she looked like a woman performing something. She could see it now, in a way she hadn't been able to when the photo was taken: the slight tension around the eyes. The smile that was technically correct, the expression of a person who has been carefully taught how to appear and is applying that teaching conscientiously. She looked capable. She looked put together. She looked, in the specific way that Beatrice had always approved of, like someone who was managing things well. In the new one, she looked like herself. She had not done anything different for the photo. She had stood in front of the DMV camera on a Wednesday afternoon when Addie was in school, and when the clerk had said ready? She had said yes and looked at the camera and let the camera find whatever was there. What was there was a woman of 36 with clear eyes and a face that had been through something and had come out the other side of it. A woman who did not look like she was performing anything. She put the old license away in the kitchen drawer where she kept documents. She put the new one back in her wallet. She looked out the window at the farm, at the maple, at the dogs, at the October afternoon that was hers, ordinary, cold, unhurried, entirely without performance. At 36, she thought, I learned that home isn't where you're born. It's where you're safe. The kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of the apple cake Dorothy had put in the oven that morning. From somewhere in the house, she could hear Addie's voice and Dorothy's voice in the easy back and forth of 2 people who have become comfortable with each other. The conversation of a family that has been found rather than given. My name is Audrey Miller. She said it quietly, to the window, to the maple, to the October light. And I am finally home. Friends, how did you find today's story? I have to tell you, sitting with Audrey through all of it, from that Tuesday when the statement arrived to that October afternoon at the farmhouse table. I kept thinking about how much courage it takes to see clearly. Not the dramatic kind of courage, not the big, cinematic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that says, I know what this number means. I know what this document means. I know what happened, even though knowing it is going to cost me everything I thought I had. Audrey lost her retirement. She lost her apartment. She lost the mother she had spent 35 years trying to be enough for. And she gained something that nobody could forge a signature on or root through an LLC: the truth of where she actually stood. And the knowledge of what she was actually made of. There's a lesson in that, I think, for all of us. We spend so much of our lives tending to the relationships we were born into, honoring them, accommodating them, finding reasons for the behavior we can't quite reconcile. And sometimes that's the right thing. Sometimes those relationships are worth every ounce of effort we put into them. But sometimes, and I think most of us have felt this at some point, what we've been calling love is something else entirely. Something that has conditions we never agreed to, costs we didn't know we were paying. Audrey didn't find her home by going back to where she came from. She found it by building one out of honesty, out of the work she knew how to do, out of the kindness of 2 people who opened a farmhouse door on Thanksgiving morning and asked no questions and expected nothing in return. We all face moments where we have to choose who we are. Audrey's moment came in a parking lot in North Carolina with $14 in her wallet and a sleeping child in the backseat. And she chose. She chose to see clearly. She chose to act on what she saw. She chose, at 36 years old, to begin. I hope this story brought you a little comfort today and something to hold on to. If Audrey's story moved you, if you found yourself in any part of it, I'd love to know. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit that like button. It means the world, and it helps more people find these stories when they need them most. Until next time, take care of yourselves. You deserve to be exactly where you're safe.